Good evening. This is Thursday, the 18th of February 2021. I'm Edward Probert. This is the reflection from Salisbury Cathedral. A couple of hours ago, I went out for a walk. Not a particularly unusual thing to do in this time of restriction. I went out with a former colleague and we walked the circuit through and around and back through town and past innumerable people whom I knew and plenty more whom I didn't. The town, to be honest, the parks and the streets of the town seemed to be thronged with people. Such a strange experience at the moment, and just some sign of the desperation people have felt to get out on this day, which for the most part has been quite pleasant compared with the weather we've had in recent times, but a sharp contrast to what I've experienced from the point of view of the number of people out and about in the last many weeks. I'm going to do something slightly unwise probably now on this broadcast. I'm going to pick up my iPad, which you're looking at me through, and shift it over to do something and show you something else in this room. And I'm also going to flip the camera alignment so that you're looking out the back of the iPad rather than through the front. So let's see if I can do that. In fact, I probably can't, so I won't do that. Oh, yes, I can. Here we are. Good. I'm going to show you this map, which, as you can see, I'm pretty incompetent with the camera work, but that is to demonstrate what sits on my wall to the left of my desk. This was given to me a couple of years ago by a great friend because we did a tour of the United States together. But it's of meaning to me as well because it demonstrates what you might loosely call the land of my fathers, or more specifically my mother's ancestral homeland up here in northern New England, in New Hampshire, where she came here in her 20s and lived the rest of her life. But all of her relatives for hundreds of years have been up there. Now, I did one reflection using that as the background many months ago and was rather startled partway through it when a message came up on my screen in front of me as I was talking. And I was rather thrown by that. I hadn't expected to receive a message, and I thought it must show something tell me something that I ought to know, like that I couldn't be heard or I was talking absolute rubbish. But in fact, it was simply a message from an American former member of our congregation, the lovely Russ Wetzel, saying, "Lovely background." Anyway, the reason I want to show you this map in particular now is to show you this down here, which in the Gulf of Mexico, on what it might call loosely the right-hand side of the United States, it shows those two little inset boxes with the Hawaiian Islands in them. And now Hawaii, of course, belongs many thousands of miles to the west in the middle of the Pacific. And over here, you can see attached to Mexico is the state of Alaska. And that, of course, is up on the bordering on Canada on the right and Russia on the left. Now, two things I want to point out to you. Alaska is considerably bigger, probably I guess about twice as big as Texas, which is there, and yet it's shown in a sort of midget size. And Hawaii is shown on the right-hand box, is shown to proportion with the rest of the map, but those islands, that archipelago at the bottom here, is shown in the same scale as Alaska is shown. So there are some things that are terribly out of proportion because otherwise you cannot get all 50 states onto one map. Anyway, enough of that. I'm going to go and sit down again and put this down and stop giving you vertigo. I'm therefore going to reverse the camera again. Here we are. Good. That's the technology left behind for the time being. Now, why on earth am I showing you a map of the United States and pointing out the tricks with proportion, the sleights of hand that have gone in order to make that map put all those states together? Well, it is just to demonstrate, to illustrate perhaps more appropriately, sometimes a change of proportion, a disproportion, is appropriate. Sometimes it's not. And I think currently that there is still quite a lot of, as you might say, disproportionate emotional feeling at large in this country, probably all the way around the world. People have lived in these strange and testing circumstances for a long time, and they've largely lived in some form of isolation. So we certainly have here for months now. And this disturbs our equilibrium. It's bound to. And it's bound also to mean that many of us lose some sensitivity in our emotional antennae and get things out of proportion. We have to take that into account. It's just life at the moment. And we need to be careful with ourselves that we don't get overreactive when other people lose that sense of proportion. But in these potentially emotionally charged times, we've just entered the season of Lent. Now, Lent is a sort of cause of groaning for a lot of people, the unwelcome prospect of maybe giving something up or being expected to give something up, losing a whole lot of things perhaps that they really enjoy. Well, nothing new there, is there, at the moment? But actually, Lent is much better seen as an opportunity than as a trial to go through. It's an opportunity to step back a bit, to cast aside some of those habits and norms in our lives, not necessarily bad things, but just to step back from them a bit and consider them a bit and consider the rest of our lives in proportion. You'll remember the story that Jesus went out into the wilderness, immediately, in fact, after his baptism, and spent 40 days and nights on his own in that lack of anything around him, that wilderness. It's a way of taking away all the distractions and going only to his own presence and the presence of God. Well, this Lent is beginning in a lockdown, unlike last Lent, which was affected by a lockdown. Here we already are. And we've also become used in our own ways to living with lockdown, even if we don't like it. We are therefore quite well able, to use this Lent profitably, to enjoy it, not to rail against things that are taken away from us, but to accept them and to look at ourselves, examine ourselves, be honest with ourselves, get things back into proportion. We're already in a desert experience. It's something people pay good money for in some circumstances. We're having a retreat without paying for it or even going outside our own houses. I'm just going to read you a poem by Robert Graves, which is called In the Wilderness. Christ, of his gentleness, thirsting and hungering, walked in the wilderness. Soft words of grace he spoke unto lost desert folk that listened wondering. He heard the bitterns call from ruined palace wall, answered them brotherly. He held communion with the she-pelican of lonely piety. Basilisk, cockatrice, flocked to his homilies, with mail of dread device, with monstrous barbed stings. with eager dragon eyes, great rats on leather wings, and poor blind broken things foul in their miseries. And ever with him went, of all his wanderings, comrade with ragged coat, gaunt ribs, poor innocent, bleeding foot, burning throat, the guileless old scapegoat. For 40 nights and days followed in Jesus' ways, sure guard behind him kept, tears like a lover wept. We all have our journeys, even if they remain steadfastly in our own walls. God bless you on your Lenten wilderness trip. Goodbye.